Feud between John Gotti Jr. and John Alite. Over the last 13 years or so, after testifying against Gotti Jr., the son of the infamous Gambino crime boss John Gotti, as well as former acting boss of the Gambinos for a period of time after his father's incarceration, John Alite published books, did numerous radio shows, television shows, and even has his own podcast and YouTube channel, using his connection to the Gotti name to boost his own name and help line his pockets. But the problem is that according to Gotti Jr., Alite was never as close to the Gottis as he claims to be. And in fact, Jr. says Alite is outright lying about most of his claims, according to interviews online and his book Shadow of My Father, published in 2014. The things Alite claims when on these public platforms is drastically different than what Gotti Jr. has to say. And in this video, we're going to get into some of the details that stand out to me when reading Gotti Jr.'s book and break down some of the differences between both men's accounts of what actually took place during their time with the Gambino family. In listening to John Alite's version of events, he has told many different stories in regards to his relationship with both John Gotti and John Gotti Jr. He said him and Gotti Jr. at one time were best friends, and he's claimed to have had meetings with the Teflon Don personally, but according to John Jr., that couldn't be further from the truth. In Shadow of My Father, Jr. states that he met Alite through a mutual friend named Johnny Gebert. Johnny Gebert was the nephew of Irish gangster Joseph Mad Dog Sullivan of the Westies. Mad Dog Sullivan had done work in the past for the Gambino family and had brought his nephew John Gebert to John Gotti's social club, the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club, which is where Jr. met Gebert for the first time. Gebert had brought actor John Voight with him to meet John Gotti, who was there to do research for his role in the movie Runaway Train, which was based on Mad Dog Sullivan's escape from Attica prison in upstate New York. John Jr. would run into Johnny Gebert every once in a while, who was usually hanging around with John Alite. Jr. met Alite around the summer of 1984 when helping his brother-in-law sell a Lincoln that had turned out to be a lemon, and Alite was the guy buying the car. He introduced himself as a friend of Gebert. Jr. says that they used to shake down Gebert for money he made from selling weed, and when they learned Alite was selling cocaine at the time, they shook him down as well, also stating that the shakedowns on Alite was years before they allowed Alite to come around the Our Friends social club. According to Jr., Alite was scared of Gebert and was controlled by Gebert through fear and would do whatever he was told. Gebert and Alite, who wanted to get in with the family, started feeding information to Jr. about the neighborhood dealers in Forest Park, so Jr. and his team could do what they called a neighborhood cleanup and chase the drug dealers out of there. Jr. also recalls his uncle Angelo Ruggiero telling him not to trust Alite because he was an Albanian and non-Italian, and said that those guys set up their own people and they were outsiders who shouldn't be trusted, which according to Jr. is exactly what happened when Alite turned federal cooperator and in 2008 testified against Jr., even though according to Jr. it was all lies. The next mention John Jr. makes of Alite in Shadow of My Father is in regards to the government's fourth trial against him when Alite testified against Jr. attempting to implicate Jr. in murders, drug dealing, and other rackets, even though Alite knew Jr. was facing the death penalty if found guilty because of certain drug laws in New York at the time. During Alite's testimony and in different books and interviews, he claims to have been making millions of dollars dealing drugs and claims John Jr. was his partner. But in Jr.'s book, he makes it a point to let the readers know Alite was only a low-level criminal who had his hands in different rackets on a small scale, stating that Alite wasn't capable enough and didn't have enough sense to handle crime on a large scale. And according to Jr., Alite's testimony was a concoction of stories formed by Alite and FBI handlers, all in the government's attempt to get a conviction on Gotti Jr. and for Alite to avoid getting a life sentence in prison. Among an array of different witnesses the government was calling to testify against John Jr., who Jr. claims were mostly criminals themselves willing to lie to get out of jail time, was a man named Kevin Bonner, who testified against Jr., but in part actually wound up helping him when he stated that Alite had told him Jr. told him he was not permitted to sell drugs, and also testified that John Jr. and John Alite's relationship had went bad, and that Alite owed Jr. some money that he had lent Alite. Also in Bonner's 302 session with the FBI, he told them that Alite had killed a man named George Grasso out of fear he would inform on it, but in Alite's testimony, he was putting the hit on Gotti Jr. Another government witness called to testify against Jr. was Michael Stratton. Stratton was friends with Alite and Bonner. All three were a part of a gang called the 7 and 9 gang. Stratton named Gotti Jr. as the man who killed his brother-in-law, Bruce Gotterup, which according to Jr. was another lie, and in fact claims it was the Gotterup murder, along with his drug dealing, that got John Alite chased out of the neighborhood. Now we're going to get into Alite's testimony and some of the discrepancies in his claims against John Jr. According to Jr.'s book, Alite was a cooperating witness with the FBI for years, but I refused to testify up until this trial against Jr. after Alite, who had fled to Brazil to avoid prosecution, was in a Brazilian penitentiary and wanted out at any cost, even if that meant using his connection to John Jr. to do it. Alite testified that Jr. was at the scene of Willie Boy Johnson's murder, but that was disproved by Frank Ganji and Samuel Bull. Both testified the job was passed on to the Bananos and never mentioned Jr. being there. The allegations Alite was making against Jr. were new charges that hadn't been brought up in any of the 3 previous trials against Gotti Jr., insinuating that Alite had inside information into the workings of the Gambino family, specifically during the John Gotti and Gotti Jr. reign as bosses of the family. But Gotti Jr. would argue that Alite was a low-level associate who could never be made because he was non-Italian and he was chased from the family in 1991. He said he was no more than a pawn who the Gambinos would sometimes use to do things they didn't want to do, and that Alite only had limited knowledge of the inner workings of the family. In the 4th trial of the United States vs. John Gotti Jr., the government used Alite as their star witness to try to get Gotti Jr. convicted of multiple murders, including not only Bruce Gotterup in 1991, but also Louis DeBono in 1990 and George Grasso's murder in 1988. The Gotterup murder was disproved by a man named John Burke, who was convicted of the murder and wrote a letter stating that Jr. wasn't aware. As for the DeBono murder, Alite claimed in a 1023 written by FBI agent Ted Otto that Gotti Sr. ordered DeBono to be murdered for not showing up to a meeting with the boss, and according to the 1023, Gotti put his son in charge of the hit, and then claimed Jr. told Bobby Borriello, Alite, and Charles Carniglia to do the job, but then stated Jr. took Alite off the hit last minute and put Kevin McMahon in his place. But when Alite was put on the stand, his testimony didn't add up with his FBI 1023 form, showing that somebody involved with the 1023 was lying. And according to Shadow of My Father, Jr. states he didn't order anyone to do the hit and he had no knowledge of it. Next, the Grasso murder. Alite testified that Gotti Jr. ordered this hit as well because Grasso was supposedly using the Gotti name to sell drugs, and despite Alite admitting to being involved in the murder and being the trigger man, he was only charged for his participation because he had dressed the hit up as being another Gotti-sanctioned hit, which again, according to Jr., isn't true. Other than the murder allegations against Jr., Alite also went on to testify that Jr. was involved in drug dealing, jury tampering. He testified that Gotti Jr. was also committing crimes in Florida and placed Jr. as the shooter in a hit attempt against a man named Vinnie Furci. But although the man was hit twice, he survived and disappeared in hiding, not to be seen again. But according to the book, when law enforcement followed up and found Furci, no bullet wounds were found on his body. And according to Jr., Ted Otto, the FBI agent, was creating these fictional stories and using Alite to push the narrative. Jr. also states in the book that a letter to the Justice Department from January 14, 2013, FBI officials admitted that they allowed federal informants to break the law 5,939 times. As previously mentioned, Jr. went on to highlight that Alite was actually an informant since 1991, according to a man named Tony Pep, and went on to say he was giving information to an agent, Randazzo, but refused to testify until Alite himself was looking at a substantial time in prison. This information was confirmed by Alite himself when he was pressed on the stand at Gotti Jr.'s Ford trial, which Alite fails to acknowledge in any of his more recent shows or interviews. After Alite's testimony and during the court breaking for a recess, Alite smirked at Jr. as if to say he could do whatever he wants and there's nothing that could be done about it, which infuriated Jr., causing him to jump up and start shouting at Alite, calling him a punk and a dog. But the situation was quickly contained and Alite was escorted out by U.S. Marshals. The Ford trial of the United States government versus John Gotti Jr. ended in a mistrial, and on December 1st, 2009, he was given bail and finally was a free man. Between 1998, when Jr. first announced La Cosa Nostra, and 2008, the government put Gotti Jr. on trial 4 times, using over 15 different prosecutors, and allowed over 100 government cooperators, mostly all of whom were violent felons, to testify against Jr. in their attempt to take down Gotti Jr. Altogether, these cooperators combined had over 100 murders under their belt, as well as hundreds of assaults and robberies, most of whom were given back their freedom or reduced sentences for testifying and were placed back into society by FBI handlers. In an interview after the Ford trial, when a juror was asked about the government's star witness, John Alite, she was quoted saying the whole jury agreed he was the least credible. John Alite continues to make claims about the Gotti family, despite the fact that he's been called out by members of the family as well as many others. There's even 2 online websites dedicated to exposing him and what they claim to be all of his lies. According to Junior's sister, Angel Gotti's YouTube channel, Gotti Jr. is working on projects to be released to the public with more information regarding Alite sometime in the near future. Obviously, according to Alite, when asked online about what the Gottis had to say, he stood by his story and continues to point the finger at Junior. Please leave a comment and let us know what you think. If you haven't already, click that subscribe button and hit the notification bell to get notifications for all new content. If you enjoyed the video, please smash the like button. Thank you for your support, and thank you for watching. It's Wise Guy TV.